As Sandra's mom left for her night shift, she managed a tired but gentle smile. Her thin frame and dark hair tied back in a hurried ponytail showed signs of wear, with deep circles under her eyes telling the story of her long hours and sacrifices. Still, there was a softness in her gaze as she hugged Sandra tightly, murmuring a promise to be back soon. Once her mom left, Sandra was alone with her stepdad. He was a large man with a rough, unkempt appearance, gray hair in disarray, and a scruffy beard. Deep lines etched his forehead, giving him a permanent scowl, and his red eyes looked unfocused as he began drinking. Soon, his voice grew loud and slurred, echoing through the house. Sandra's heart pounded. She ran to her room, slamming the door and locking it behind her. Moments later, he was at her door, banging hard enough to rattle the frame. The doorknob broke, and he burst in, his face twisted in anger. Sandra backed up, trembling, and tried to keep distance between them. As he stumbled closer, fear overwhelmed her, and everything went dark. In the early morning, Sandra awoke to silence. Her mom still wasn't home, and her stepdad was sprawled out on the couch, snoring loudly. Spotting the padlock key nearby, Sandra seized the moment. She grabbed it and quietly unlocked the door, but the padlock fell with a loud clink, stirring her stepdad awake. He spotted her immediately, and she panicked, bolting out of the house with him staggering after her. She ran as fast as she could, reaching a road at the edge of the forest, where she found a truck with the back doors open. Without thinking, she climbed inside and hid among the crates just as the truck pulled away, leaving her stepdad behind. The truck soon stopped, and Luke, a man with kind, thoughtful eyes, stepped out. His brown, ashy hair and a few scars from a long-ago accident gave him a rugged appearance softened by his gentle expression. When he opened the back of the truck, he was startled to find a young girl hidden among the crates. Sandra, realizing she'd been discovered, scrambled to her feet, accidentally knocking over a stack of crates. Fruits tumbled out, rolling across the floor, and Sandra, now covered in them, looked up with embarrassment. Luke chuckled, unfazed by the mess, and offered her a hand. "Why are you hiding here? What's your name?" Sandra hesitated, brushing off bits of fruit from her clothes. I'm Sandra," she mumbled shyly. Seeing her exhaustion, Luke handed her some fruit and a bottle of water. After she gratefully accepted, he studied her a moment before gently suggesting, "You look like you could use a break. How about you rest at my place for a bit?" Sandra, her guard lowering, nodded gratefully. Soon, she found herself in Luke's warm, cozy home, seated on a soft sofa. As she settled in, she gazed out the window, listening to the gentle chirping of birds. The peaceful surroundings felt miles away from the storm of emotions still churning inside her. As Luke studied Sandra sitting quietly, nervously fiddling with her sleeve, a strange familiarity washed over him. Something about her presence tugged at a long-buried memory, yet he couldn't quite grasp it. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he asked gently, wanting to encourage her to share. Sandra looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I've had to run away before," she admitted quietly, her voice trembling. "Run away?" Luke echoed, intrigued. "How old were you?" 7, she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "Things at home were really bad. I was scared, and I thought running away would help." His heart ached at the thought of her being so young and frightened. "That sounds so tough," he said softly. "But running away, didn't you think about what could happen?" She shook her head, her expression filled with regret. "I just wanted to escape. I didn't think about anything else." Luke's pulse quickened. The mention of Oak Ridge earlier echoed in his mind, but he brushed it off, trying to focus on her. "I get it. Sometimes it feels like the only option." "Yeah, I just wish things were different," Sandra murmured, her eyes searching his for understanding. "Me too," Luke said, feeling an unspoken bond growing between them. "You're safe here now. You can stay as long as you need." "I hope so," she whispered, looking away. The air between them felt charged, hinting at something deeper as Sandra's vulnerability mixed with his emerging memories. Luke knew there was a connection but couldn't place it yet. He had to tread carefully. As Sandra's mind wandered, memories flooded back to that fateful night. She was only 7, small and scared in a home that felt more like a cage. That night, her father, who had been drinking heavily, grew irritable as she kept asking about her mom's return. "Dad, when is Mom coming back?" Sandra asked in a quiet voice. He didn't answer, his face darkening as she repeated her question, hoping for reassurance. Finally, he exploded, his patience snapping. "Why do you keep asking? She's not coming back!" The words stung, and then he struck her, hard. Shocked and terrified, Sandra's instinct was to run. She dashed into the woods, her thin legs carrying her as far as they could. The cold night air bit at her skin, her torn clothes catching on branches as she ran, her heart hammering in her chest. At last, she stumbled out onto an empty road, tears blurring her vision. Exhausted and afraid, she froze when she saw headlights approaching a car coming down the road. She covered her face in fear as it drew closer. Inside the car, Luke's wife, a gentle-looking woman with bright blonde hair, drove with their young daughter in the back seat. They laughed together, singing along to the radio, unaware of the danger ahead. In an instant, their laughter turned to horror as they spotted Sandra on the road. Swerving to avoid her, the car veered off the road, slamming into a rock with a sickening crunch. The sound echoed through the still night, but Sandra, too young to comprehend, turned and ran back into the woods, unaware of the tragedy she had left behind. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the small living room as Luke and Sandra sat across from each other. The tension that had lingered between them for days now felt like a heavy weight, almost suffocating. They had shared stories, laughter, and even a few quiet moments, but something still felt unresolved. "Sandra," Luke began, his voice steady but soft. "Can I ask you something that's been on my mind?" She nodded, her expression serious. "Of course." He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. "You mentioned earlier that you ran away from home when you were 7. Can you tell me more about what happened that night?" Sandra's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her shirt. "I was scared. My dad was angry and drinking again. I just wanted to get away from it all. I didn't think about the road, or what could happen." Luke felt his chest tighten. He remembered that night vividly, the fear, the confusion, and the moment everything changed. "What road was it?" he asked cautiously. It was a road near Oak Ridge," Sandra replied hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke's heart raced. Memories flooded back the headlights, the sound of screeching tires, and the horror that followed. "Sandra," he said slowly, his voice trembling, "did you see a car that night? A family driving?" Tears filled Sandra's eyes as she looked up, understanding dawning in her expression. I remember. I was standing in the road when a car came. I froze and I think it swerved. I didn't mean for anything to happen." Luke's breath caught in his throat. "That was my wife and daughter," he said, his voice cracking. "They were in that car." Sandra's eyes widened in horror, and she covered her mouth with her hands as tears streamed down her cheeks. I didn't mean to cause any harm. I was just a kid. I was scared." "I know," Luke said softly, his heart breaking for the little girl she had been. "But that night changed everything for me. I lost them, and I've carried that pain ever since." Sandra's sobs echoed in the room as she leaned forward, her hands shaking. "I'm so sorry, Luke. I wish I could take it back. I never wanted to hurt anyone." Luke reached across the small distance between them, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It was an accident, Sandra. You were just trying to find safety. We both lost so much that night." The weight of their shared grief hung in the air, but amid the sorrow, an unexpected bond began to form, a connection forged in pain, but also in understanding. Maybe we can help each other heal?" Sandra suggested, her voice still shaky but filled with hope. Luke nodded, wiping away his own tears. "I'd like that. We can't change the past, but we can find a way to move forward." They sat together in silence, the understanding between them deepening, knowing they had both been shaped by that tragic night. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but together they could find a way to navigate the shadows of their past. As the days passed, the bond between Sandra and Luke seemed to grow, yet there was an unspoken tension simmering beneath the surface. The weight of their shared history lingered, and Luke found himself increasingly withdrawn, retreating into solitude to process the re-emerged grief and guilt. He spent long hours alone, staring at old photographs, memories resurfacing that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Sandra noticed the change and felt a gnawing sense of rejection. She had started to feel safe with Luke, but his coldness now felt like abandonment. She began to question if staying was a mistake, if deep down he could never truly forgive her. One evening, when Luke returned home late and found Sandra waiting for him, the silence finally broke. "Why are you shutting me out, Luke?" Sandra's voice was trembling, a mixture of anger and hurt. Luke hesitated, then sighed. "Sandra, it's a lot. I just need time." "Time?" she replied, her tone sharpening. "I thought you wanted to help me. You said we could help each other, but now it feels like you're blaming me." He winced, struggling to put his emotions into words. "I'm not blaming you, Sandra. It's just, sometimes, when I look at you, I see that night. I see everything I lost." Her heart sank as she listened. "So, you'll never see me as more than the girl who took them away?" The words hung heavily in the air, and Luke, caught off guard, struggled for a response. "Sandra, that's not—" But Sandra's anger took over, her voice rising. "Maybe I shouldn't have stayed. Maybe I'm just a reminder of everything you hate." She choked on her words, tears filling her eyes as she turned away, hurt and ashamed. Luke, watching her storm toward the door, realized too late the weight of his silence. As she reached for the handle, he finally spoke, his voice soft yet pained. "Sandra, wait." But she shook her head, whispering, "I thought I could start over. But maybe I was wrong." With that, she walked out, leaving Luke alone in the empty room. His heart pounded with regret, realizing that his own pain had pushed away the one person who could understand. The silence that followed felt heavier than ever. It was late the next evening when Sandra found herself wandering back to the familiar road leading to Luke's home. She had spent the night at a nearby shelter, wrestling with a storm of emotions, hurt, regret, and a longing to finally find peace. Despite everything, she couldn't shake the feeling that she belonged there, that there was something unfinished between her and Luke. When she reached his doorstep, she hesitated, uncertain if he would even want to see her. Just as she was about to turn away, the door opened, and there was Luke, looking as worn and sleepless as she felt. They stared at each other in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "Sandra," Luke began, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry. I never meant to make you feel like you didn't belong. My pain, it's not your fault." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I could make it right somehow," she said, her voice trembling. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was just a reminder of what you lost." Luke shook his head, stepping closer. "You're not just a reminder, Sandra. You're more than that. I see now that holding on to the past only made me lose what I could have in the present. You've become a part of my life, and that matters more than the pain I held on to." She looked at him, hopeful yet hesitant. "I wanted to feel like I could start over, like I was worth something, maybe even worth forgiving." Luke's expression softened as he reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sandra, I don't need to forgive you. You never did anything wrong. But maybe we both need to forgive ourselves. For what happened, for everything we couldn't control. We've both been running from the past for too long." Sandra took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift as she nodded. "So, what now?" He gave her a small, hopeful smile. "We move forward, together, one step at a time." In that moment, an understanding passed between them, a quiet recognition of their shared scars and the promise of healing. As they sat together in the warmth of Luke's home, the tension of the past began to dissolve, leaving space for a future they could finally shape together. A future not defined by loss, but by a bond forged from understanding and compassion. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over them, they knew that whatever lay ahead, they could face it together.